thank you for being here after the reception last night, making it this early morning. And it's a pleasure to be here with you all. I have been listening to the birds and reminding me how much I enjoy being here and miss it in a sense. So, although it's a long trip here, how many of you had to fly here for some reason or another, or have flown recently? I find that increasingly challenging. And, the glamour of air travel is gone. Just going to the airport, just using the washroom is confusing these days, right? It used to be you'd step up and there's handles and everything, but now you go there and you're not sure what's going to be automated. And so you kind of, I have to assess it first and take a look and figure out what I'm going to do, and then, if it's the faucet, I put my hands under here and try and make sure that the water's going. And no, it's not usually going over there, but you're finding it, and then the soap dispenser, is that a knob on the porcelain, or is that actually the soap dispenser? You put your hand in. Oh, sorry about that. No. And even the hair dryer, and the hand dryer, air, and those can be manual as well. And but if you put your hand there and it doesn't start working, you're not sure, is it broken, or do I have my hands in the wrong place? And you start doing all sorts of things trying to get it to work. Pretty soon you're doing the washroom tango. And the point is not to, of this silliness, there actually is a point to it. And the point is that as things go faster and we get more information, we're beginning to realize that this predictability of the world is a little bit less than we might assume. This is, a fractal. To me, it's the face of chaos. And the situations we, and more importantly, our students are going to be facing going forward are going to be more ambiguous, more unique, less certain. And the problem is that an industrial age education is no longer going to work in an information age world. And I think we need a shift. Now, here's the thing. I know you've heard this before. But I want to talk a little bit about what that shift needs to be and why, and try and convince you that there's a direction we know that we can go forward. And I realize the barriers are systemic, but I think we have the opportunity now to make that change. So a little bit about my background that Sandra gave me a very gracious introduction. I want to give you a little bit deeper history so you understand the strange and twisted way I look at the world. And the filters I'm bringing so you can interpret what I say with that characteristic. My first job out of college, and I designed my own major in computers and education. I saw the connection and was able to create my own learning. And my first job out of college was designing and programming educational computer games, which has been a recurrent theme, and as Sandra knows, and part of the reason she brought me. And I went back to grad school because I knew we didn't know enough about how people really learn and how to design systems for that. And so I did a PhD, as you mentioned, in applied cognitive science. And most of the team there was working on how do we design systems for the way people think, and my twist on it was how do we design systems for the way people learn. And what I've been doing for the past, 30-odd years, I hate to say, I help organizations use technology in ways that align with how we think, work, and learn. This has included a lot of stuff, including games, but mobile learning, adaptive systems, content engines. But at core, it's really just trying to deeply apply what we know about how our brains work to design toys. I'm a boy and I like toys. Design technology to meet real needs. So, as Sandra mentioned, I recently joined the Wadhwani Foundation. You have to understand what this foundation is about. The founder was born in India, came to the US, built and sold a company for billions, and so he's now a billionaire. But fortunately, he's taken that philanthropic attitude like the Gates-Buffett pledge and is committing a large proportion of his fortune to do good. And what he believes is that he wants people to be able to have jobs that allow them to successfully raise families. He started in India about 10 years ago with entrepreneurship, because most of the people who were graduating were going into existing companies, and he thought that wasn't enough opportunity, so we wanted new companies, so he invested in entrepreneurship. And then he realized that for those new jobs, but also for the existing jobs. The existing companies had jobs that needed to be filled, and there were a bunch of people that needed work, but they didn't have the skills for those jobs. So he started job skilling programs, the second initiative, and that's been underway for 3 years in India. And then in the US, he recognized that while they don't need the entrepreneurship, there are similarly people without jobs and jobs that need to be filled. And so we started a year ago in the US, and as part of that process, finally realized maybe we need to look at the learning, and that's where I came into the picture. And so what we're doing is vocational focused learning, which I think has a strong relationship to what you're doing, which I think is part of the picture we're talking about. So this should be easy, right? We have education systems, right? And they're supposed to be preparing people for workplace. I don't know how many of you have seen Mark Warschauer's book, Learning in the Cloud. And it's not about, doesn't have really anything to do with the cloud, but it is about how we're conducting learning. And he says there's only three things wrong with our current education system: our curriculum, our pedagogy, and the way we use technology. Our curriculum is blind leading the blind. Experts can't tell us what they do. They don't have access to it, quite literally. 70% of what they do, according to the Cognitive Technology Unit at the University of Southern California, is inaccessible. So they tell us what they know. So we tend to have a lot of knowledge dump and information test. And we have abstract problems. And David Jonasson, who I've heard Aaron referring to yesterday, showed how the problems we give kids in school bear no relation to the problems they face in the real world. Our pedagogy is wrong. We still have a sage on the stage. There's a reason why it works here, because you're active in practice, so this is a reflection opportunity for you. But in general, it doesn't make sense for novice learners. And yet we tend to have this old school type of model. And the way we use technology isn't appropriate. We're using it for that content presentation instead of in more effective ways to support learning. So this is the wrong way, and you know this. So the question is, what do we need to do? And I want to talk a little bit about how we really think, work, and learn to drive what we're doing at the foundation, and some principles I think apply more generally, not just to the vocationally focused that Charles Sturt may be taking, but to education in general. So starting with how we think. And unfortunately, we still have this model that we think like a computer. We're these formal, logical, reasoning beings. And when we have an issue we're dealing with, we come up and front up and deal with it in formal, logical ways. And there's only one problem with that: it's not true. We don't do it all in our heads, and we don't do it formally and logically almost at all. That's actually very effortful. If you look at Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about that most of the thinking we do on intuition and quick judgment. This is the thinking fast. And that's great in areas we're well practiced in. But we overgeneralize and overuse it, and we use our slow thinking to rationalize why we made that decision. And we reserve that deep thinking when we absolutely have to, but we avoid it, and it's effortful. In fact, it fatigues quickly. Here's a hint: if you ever have to face a judge and perish the thought, you want to catch them early in the day. They did studies in Israel of judges, and they found that through the day, their judgments got harsher and more simplistic. Because of that is effortful work and their brain's fatigue. So we have to sort it. And Andy Clark's Being There points out how we recontextualize our thinking in every new situation. We don't approach it the same way. We don't bring this pure abstract. It's reconstructed on the fly. And Ed Hutchins' Cognition in the Wild helped us realize that we distribute our cognition in the world, and it's not all in our heads. We have to put it out in the world to support appropriate reasoning. We have limitations on our cognitive capability. So this begins to also influence. So what our brains are really good at is pattern matching and meaning making. We can read a story and follow multiple themes, but we don't remember the exact words by and large. Remember the story. We're not good at rote memorization, and we're really bad at rote execution. We have a little bit of randomness built into our architecture. So trying to get us to do stuff by rote is kind of broken. And we have limits on how much arbitrary processing we can do. So if we face a problem just unassisted, we're not near as effective as we're assisted with support that provides that rote memory and that perfect processing. This is why digital technology and mobile have avoided the Gartner hype cycle and have become part of our lives so quickly, because they provide that exact opposite. Digital technology is really bad at pattern matching. It's incredibly hard to get that to do it, but it's great at remembering rote things perfectly. So when we complement ourselves with this technology, which is much more effective, which has implications for how we work. So we have this vision of we go away and we think individually and we come up with this, and then we come back to the workplace with our well-formed thoughts. And that's a nice myth, but it's not true. We work together, and we work resourced in the world. When you look at Atul Gawande's checklist manifesto, where a simple little checklist flipped the mortality rate in the developing world from 80% to 20%. Complex reasons why that work, but it's the support for us following procedures that we don't execute perfectly without support. And Dan Pink's drive, recognize the emotional component of what we do, that when we're motivated, we perform better. How many of you perform best when you're unmotivated? Right. The myth of the individual innovator going away and coming back has been busted. Not just geniuses by Keith Sawyer, but Stephen Berlin Johnson's Where Good Ideas Come From. Point out the fact that really thinking works better when we bring people together. Okay, there's a limit, I have to admit. You know, the room is smarter than the smartest person in the room, with a caveat, if you manage the process right. But if you do, this works. And so we want to support people. We can't think of the individual mind. We want to think of people working in a resourced world where their access to formal resources, their access to informal resources, their active and reflective support, so support in the moment as well as support developing us over time, and our access independently and to other people and their thoughts are surrounding us so that we're focused on the task and we have the tools to hand cognitively as well as physically. And finally, how we learn. And as you well know, that this notion of having students in class and calling on them, there's this sort of still persistent myth that they do meaningful processing and then they come up with a deep answer, but they don't. What happens in classrooms is it's very low-level interrogatory and response, and evaluation of that response, and not the deep thinking. What learning really looks like is this. And as an aside, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to find a way to get a picture of your family into your presentation. This is quite old now. That sweet little girl on the right is now 15 with a colored streak in her hair and multiple piercings. But this is what learning looks like, with scaffolding to get her up to the same level, and doing real tasks and messy and getting your hands dirty. And yes, we don't want to do this at risk of our dinner at night or people's lives in a more complex situation, so we scaffold that and support it and simulate it and run role plays to make this practice meaningful. But we know good principles of learning. John Bransford and the Blue Ribbon Commission came up with the book, How People Learn, Research into Practice. Julie Dirkson's lovely book, Designed for How People Learn, where she did the book that I would have loved to have done, but she did it better, where she compiled the cognitive science research into some really good design principles. The Series E-Learning Manifesto, where I and 3 colleagues, so frustrated with what was happening in organizational learning, we created a manifesto of 8 values and 22 supporting principles. They're not all principles, by the way. We're just compiling research principles. We tried to get an operationalized list. But we know what to do. There's guidance for doing it right. We just have to pay attention and be willing to make the effort and commit to do it. So let's go a little deeper, a little higher, a little deeper, and look at some things that I think are important. One of them is to recognize that learning, individual learning, is action and reflection. We can act And we get feedback, but until we reflect on it, it doesn't become part of our repertoire. Now that's actually, well and good, but if we really want to be effective and efficient at it, that's where we come from learning to instruction. We have designed action, where we structure a series of activities for them to learn from, and we guide the reflection on that to help point them to the models that we think are important. This has important consequences. It means a curriculum is not a series of content. A curriculum is a series of activities that take the learner from where they are now to where they can be. Learning is not about, we don't learn for intellectual self-gratification. We learn to be able to do things we can't do now. And the way we develop abilities to do and to make better decisions is by putting in places to practice that and having facilitated reflection. There is a role for content, but that content you're driven to it by the needs of the activities, as opposed to having it a priori. And the output of that activity is work products, because we want learners producing things so that we can examine them and understand what they're doing well and what they're not doing. And in fact, we ask them typically to include rationales, reflections about it that we can examine, because that gives us a basis for evaluation and mentoring. This is also a natural way to use tools to access content, to produce work product, to capture reflection. Instead of this content presentation, they're supporting these meaningful activity, and it brings in the 21st century skills, because this is how you're going to work after the learning experience. You're going to be accessing information, you're going to be producing work product, you're going to be explaining your thoughts behind it. So this develops the ability. I don't like complex taxonomies. Brenda Sugaru did a wonderful evisceration of Bloom's. I think Bloom's is far too complex and unusable. Van Moerenborg has his 4-component instructional design with a much simpler model. Just the stuff you need to know and the complex problems you apply it to solve it, with the emphasis on the application. And we've got to space the learning out. The event model of learning doesn't work. Here's what happens. If you do a whole bunch of event model, you actually do better on the test, but it dissipates really quickly. Because in our brains, what happens is learning is strengthening relationships between patterns of activation. And the important point here is that there's only so much strengthening can happen at any one day before you literally need sleep for that strengthening to be able to happen some more the next day. So for learning to be really powerful, to be persistent, you need to space out that learning. And then you get this curve. The normal learning curve, that's your college experience, right? You cram for the test, do well on the test. 3 days later, you may have forgotten everything. I highly recommend Father Guido Sarducci's skit, The 5-Minute University, if you want to understand that a little bit, or viscerally and humorously. Or the reactivation curve. If you reactivate it over time, it's there when they need it. Now, if we're not creating a learning experience that'll be there when they need it, why are we bothering? So it's a bit of a commitment. And social. We know that the better outcomes, whether it's better product ideas or better learning outcomes, happen with more people. There's a cap on this. And, you've got to get the process right. But the richness that occurs from learning together is more powerful. One of the things we ignore is the emotional experience. I already mentioned how many of you learn when you're unmotivated. How many of you learn best when you're really anxious? Usually I get a couple hands, and there are people who handle a lot of stress, but the Yerkes-Dodson law shows that under a little bit of stress you perform better, but that tends to be quite low, particularly for novices. And not a lot of stress at all. And so we should be consciously worrying about not just the learning content, the learning activity, but the emotional component of it. We should be building learners' motivation up front. We should try and assuage their anxiety and build their confidence as we go through. How many of you consciously do this in your learning design? And yet it creates a learning experience that's more effective. And I'm going to introduce you to a principle I found incredibly useful, the least assistance. Here's a hint. what's the least I can do for you is not a rude response. People don't actually want everything. They want enough to get them back into work. And that holds true for learning as well. We tend to give all the nice to have. And that gets lost, and it's wasted a lot of time. We need to get trimmed down to what's really going to make a difference. And it actually is hard work. I can take most e-learning I've found and reduce it from 40 to 60%, including my own. It takes 2 passes. But if we really focus on trying to figure out what's the least we can do, we can actually get away around this problem of, oh, there's more and more we have to fit in every year. Well, let's see if we really need it. So what does this bring us to? So with the Wadhwani Foundation, we're a pragmatic basis. Yes, he's a billionaire, but he didn't get a billionaire by wasting money. So I told him, before I got on, I said, fast, cheap, or good, pick 2, the old engineering rubric. I said, if good isn't one of them, I'm not your guy. So that was fine, but when I talked to the founder, I recited that, and I said, my mantra is fast, cheap, and good enough. So the question is, what is good enough? And this is the traditional law of diminishing returns. It's hypothetical, but if you think about purchasing a stereo, you can spend a little bit of money and get kind of a tinny speaker. You can spend a bit more money and get something nice. You can spend thousands, get this really high audio, but I think the level of return you get is not necessarily advancing as fast as the amount of money you're spending. And I think I'm proposing that that's true for development. Down here is this rapid e-learning, which we see too often, which is that information dump and knowledge test with rapid e-learning tools, which are easy to do and let you crank stuff out quickly. But the value of it for learning is almost negligible. At the far side is this really scientifically rigorous, where you use cognitive task analysis with your subject matter experts, with a team of them over a couple weeks to really get down to the core material. And you develop these rigorous, custom, intelligently adaptive systems. That's lovely if you have those resources. We don't. We have to operate pragmatically. So my hypothesis that I'm proposing and trying to test in life is to say that if we apply some heuristic learning science at 40% of the cost, we get 80% of the benefit. This is still to be tested, but I think that there's a plausible case to be made that this is indeed the way we should go, and that's what I'm trying to put into practice. What's it look like? So we, by nature, have to have a blended experience. Because we're doing hands-on vocational stuff, we have things that they have to do with hardware, and with, for medical assistants, they actually have to use a blood pressure cuff. And we're working, at least in the US, with the community college system. So they have a notion where they come into the class. So we've got a pre-class, in-class, and post-class model. So introduction, we introduce them to it in a way that opens them up emotionally, helps them visually understand why. We have conversation, by the way, there's sort of the procedural, the things you actually have to do, and sometimes some concepts behind it. So, using a blood pressure cuff and understanding the sound, the flow of the blood in the heart so that you know what the sounds are and where you should be measuring. Or in the case of, so our 2 courses we're doing right now are medical assistant and cybersecurity in the US. In cybersecurity, this would be actually setting up a wireless network that's secure, and this would be understanding the types of attack that can come. And we give them the concept, and we give them processing tasks or actually simulated practice to get them ready. And we have them develop some work product that there's reflection on in class, and then we give them practice together doing it. And it can be role plays, it can be actually using the equipment. It's ways to process that information in a social way so you hear how other people are thinking of it and enriching your understanding. And what we're doing out post-class is giving some additional practice across different contexts that gives them the breadth and depth that they can take forward. It's not going to be every situation, but it's going to be those ones that we need them to take into the workplace and be prepared to go. So what does this look like? We start with WIFM objectives. The objectives we use to design learning, like able to accurately conduct a successful measurement 8 out of 10 times, that's not what they want to read. They want to read, I want to take accurate measurements of patients. We transform those into things that the learners care about. This is part of addressing the emotional equation. Our concepts are model-based. a lot of evidence that the way you're going to cope with ambiguity is not rote procedures, but knowing the model behind it so that you are capable of adapting it, able to make inferences and predictions about how to adapt it in different circumstances. You may give them the procedure that you expect them to follow, but you give them the model behind it so when things are difficult. There was a lovely example given to me 2 days ago when we were talking with folks about simulation games about, well, you're supposed to put this emergency tracheotomy tube into a throat to keep it open. What happens if somebody's in an accident and you can't actually get the right angle on the neck to put it in? How do you adapt? You're not going to do that without a model of what's important underneath, and maybe a model of the neck, so you know what you can do and what you can't do, or how you might get around it. Applied thinking. So in the case of blood pressure, we have somebody who works out, but they also have a bad diet. What does that imply? We're asking them to make inferences about the models to make understanding how things work. And in the case of the conceptual information, we ask them to do meaningful processing. We don't just give them the information. We ask them to use it, to synthesize it, to perhaps create a job aid. Or we ask them to communicate it in a way, to present it to somebody else. So we're asking them to process the information because that makes it stick. If you just click to learn more, washes over and isn't there. If you make them use that information, it's more likely to be understood and used. And in the case of real procedures, we do simulations. So in the case of blood pressure, they click to inflate, they click to let the air out, and then the needle starts going, and they're listening. There's an audio track that goes with it, and they have to listen and hear for the various cough sounds, and figure out which one they said, so get a chance to practice skills. This is all pre-class. But we're developing the skills they're going to be using so they're prepared, and we're spacing it out over time. And don't tend to make random errors. There is some randomness in our architecture, but we tend to make pattern errors because we bring in the wrong models. How many of you have ever taken a quiz where the alternatives to the right answer were either so silly or dumb or nonsensical that you didn't actually have to know anything to pass that quiz? I get that nod and recognition, right? That's a waste of time. It has no influence on anything of any meaning. The right alternatives to the right answer are ways they go wrong. Two reasons. It lets you make that mistake where it's safe, and you have a chance to address it. By the way, I hate tools that only have one piece of feedback for every wrong answer. It's nuts. It doesn't give you the chance to address the misconceptions. So our curriculum is changing, and we're not there yet. We haven't had a chance to work with the new curriculum. When I came on board, they always had relationships with the community colleges. But where I'm trying to go is work with the experts, and I'm going to try and get panels of industry practitioners to come up with a set of competencies that define it, that then we have a series of activities that develop those competencies. We map those into pre-posted in-class actions, develop them, and content resources are available, are chosen to be there with a caveat that will come up. Now, this is all very practical, but where does the unleashing imagination come in? That's the premise, right? I'm going to suggest that to do that, we have to go up another level. I love cheesy clip art, okay. Across the curriculum, whether it's medical assistant or cybersecurity or whatever else, we need to have these tasks, these 21st century information processing tasks, to communicate to others, to research and problem solve, to develop solutions. And we need to have those inserted at various points across that curriculum. And we need to assess those separately. And they need to get richer in complexity so that they start with relatively simple tasks. Synthesize these two pre-prepared documents versus synthesize these sort of more real documents versus go out on the internet, find relevant documents, and come back with a synthesis. We're developing those 21st century skills over time, and we have to assess them separately. And unfortunately, I don't know yet of an LMS that has the ability to not only track this, but to track this as well. And yet that's where we're going to develop not only the models to adapt that job, but the ability to be employable and reemployable and hold the job for a lifetime. And I believe that's an important outcome of our learning as well. So in our case, we're trying to begin to have steps like look up online resources and create a list. So we're asking them to do these tasks, and we're starting off, and we have some technical challenges in implementing this with the learners we have on tap, but we're going to put it into place. The point is to not only have them doing the work and developing the abilities to do the work, but to be able to reflect on that as well. That actually changes our curriculum a bit. From a series of activities, hit the right button, we need to start having some of them that the learners begin to choose. They begin to say, we need you to evaluate a product with these constraints, pick a product and evaluate it. And gradually more, design a product. We need to start getting them taking responsibility, because as they take on the ability to decide their own curriculum, they become independent and self-learners. They will begin to choose the content they look at from a selection. They will begin to choose the work products they create. And they will begin to choose how they communicate the reflection. So the ones with a little stipple are ones they begin to choose. To do that, and this gives us, again, an opportunity to mentor and reflect, but at two levels now, not just on the work product, but on their choices of ways to address this, so we can develop their thinking as well. And to do that, we need to annotate our own thinking and make explicit why we chose these series of tasks, so they can understand what learning design looks like and they can apply that to themselves. But their ability to become self-improving learners is a truly valuable contribution to them as learners and as graduates of programs. And I think it's truly valuable to them, to the institution, and to society at large. So there's a road ahead. You know that it has to go, but I've tried to portray a little bit of the thinking at least I'm putting in place. I've taken this position after 10, 12 years of consulting, talking about how people should be doing it, to see if I'm really full of it or actually what I'm thinking is true. We're going to see, the proof is in the pudding, but I think there's principal reasons to believe this is the way to go. So our curriculum that's activity-based and model-driven, that has people doing real work in a scaffolded and supported and reflective environment, with technology used as tools to get the job done as the way they will after the learning experience. That's the revolution I'm trying to spark. I believe we can do it. I believe we need to do it. I encourage you to join me in the revolution. Thank you very much.